Hi, everyone. Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Jennifer Melton, and I'm the Communications Coordinator for the Wilson Center for Science and Justice here at Duke Law. Thank you for coming to the latest in our Novel Justice series, where we invite authors who have written recent scholarship on a wide-ranging issues related to the criminal legal system. We are excited to have with us today Kristin Henning, the author of The Rage of Innocence, How America Criminalizes Black Youth. Professor Henning has very generously brought 2 books for giveaway. If you haven't registered for that giveaway, there is a sign-up sheet outside the classroom where the burritos are. I'll leave it until after the event, so please go sign up. We also have an order form if you'd like to order the book from Duke Bookstore. They'll place that order and contact you when it's ready, and you can sign up for that as well. If you want to do both and then you get the giveaway, we can also then cancel the order. Just let me know. And please feel free to let me know if you have any questions. I'll be here throughout the event. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Henning. Kristin Henning is the Bloom Professor of Law and Director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law, where she supervises law students and represents youth accused of delinquency in the D.C. Superior Court. Professor Henning served as the law school's Associate Dean for Clinics and Experiential Learning from 2017 to 2020. Professor Henning first joined the faculty in 1995 as a Stuart Stiller Fellow in Criminal and Juvenile Justice Clinics. After her fellowship, Professor Henning joined the staff of the Public Defender Service for the District of Columbia, where she continued to represent clients and helped organize a juvenile unit designed to meet the multidisciplinary needs of children in the juvenile legal system. Professor Henning served as lead attorney for the juvenile unit from 1998 until she left the Public Defender Service to return to the Law Center in 2001. Professor Henning writes extensively about race, adolescence, and policing, including her book that she's talking about here today, The Rage of Innocence. It was published in 2021 and was featured on the front page of the New York Times Book Review and received rave reviews in the Washington Post. The book was awarded a 2022 Media for a Just Society Award by Evident Change and the 2022 Social Justice Advocacy Award from the In the Margins Book Awards Committee. We are especially excited to have her back at Duke, her alma mater, where she received her undergraduate degrees in African American Studies and English. After her talk, she will be joined for a conversation moderated by Crystal Grant, director of our Children's Law Clinic at Duke. Crystal Grant joined the faculty of Duke Law in 2018 and directs the Children's Law Clinic, an interprofessional medical legal partnership. Professor Grant's research interests are in accommodating students with disabilities, health justice, and interprofessional education. Her research has been published in the Fordham Urban Law Journal, Loyola University Chicago Law Journal, Clinical Law Review, and the NYU Journal of Legislation and Public Policy. In addition to the Children's Law Clinic, Professor Grant teaches interdisciplinary project-based seminars. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kristin Henning and Professor Kristin Henning.
All right. Thank you all so much for showing up today, this afternoon. Thank you, Jennifer, for the invitation, and Brandon Garrett for the invitation from the Wilson Center on Science and Justice. I really want to say that it has been great to meet and reconnect with some old friends and some new friends, Professors Fogel, Fine, Nicholson, and I can't wait to be in conversation with Professor Grant momentarily. So I want to dive right in just to what we figured we would do is just give you like a 15, no more than 20-minute introductory comments, and then we will engage in conversation. And the way I want to start is this. I have been representing children in the nation's capital for the last 26 years, right? In delinquency cases for 26 years. But what is so shocking about that is that in that entire time, I have only represented 4 white children. That is it. Every other child in my caseload has been African American, and everybody should gasp at that, right? For those of you who are not familiar with the District of Columbia, might think that maybe, there are no white kids in the nation's capital. You would be wrong, right? Or that white children aren't committing crimes. We also know that's not true as well, given everything that we know about adolescence. So it became hard for me to continue to do the work as long as I have been doing it and still am doing it through the clinic over the last 26 years without wanting to ask the hard questions. Questions like, why do these extreme disparities exist, not just in DC, but all over the United States? Number two, how do these disparities, in my mind, this is really one of the critically important questions. How do these disparities affect Black youth mentally, physically, psychologically, developmentally? And if this disparate policing or criminalization of Black youth is it justified? That's a question. But assuming that it's not, then what do we do about it, right? And so ultimately, I ended up writing the book, The Rage of Innocence, that grew very much out of the cases and the children that I was meeting and working with. And so I think the best way to help you see what I saw or am seeing and what I learned from writing is to tell you a story about a client that we represented in our clinic, the Juvenile Justice Clinic at Georgetown. This is a child I'll call Sharice for purposes of the book and for our conversation. Sharice was a 17-year-old girl who got into an argument with her boyfriend. During the course of the argument, she became convinced that her boyfriend was cheating on her. So she's arguing with him at school. She reaches out, grabs his cell phone, and begins to walk away down the hallway. As she's walking away, she's scrolling through his text messages to see if he's been communicating with someone else. A school resource officer sees this and decides to intervene. Anybody want to guess? How did he intervene? Arrested her. He arrests this child, and she is taken into custody, held in detention overnight, and formally prosecuted. Yes. The next day, I want you to think about how many agencies have now touched this child's life. She is prosecuted in court the next day for robbery, you all, felony robbery, taking the property of another by stealth. All right. So when I get this case, me and my student, we go into court, we pick up this case, and we're thinking this must be some serious violent felon because it's a robbery under the FBI Index of Crimes. Come to realize she is just a child doing what an average teenager would do. Dare I ask whether any of you would have done such a thing, right? So whenever I talk about in different settings the criminalization of Black children, Black and brown children, people automatically assume that I must. Actually, let me back out. When I talk about the arrest, prosecution, and detention of children, period, people automatically assume that I must be talking about serious violent offenses, right? Rape, murder, gun cases, carjacking cases, real robberies, not the one that my client, Sharice, was alleged to have committed. People automatically assume. What the data shows is that the vast majority of children who enter the juvenile legal system in particular are not involved in these types of offenses that we are most afraid of. In fact, the data shows around 9% of children entering the space are in for the types of serious offenses that we are most concerned about. Instead, we see children coming into court for behaviors that arise out of what we consider normal adolescent features or features of adolescence. Let me quickly throw out, have you all, what do you know about adolescence? What one word would you throw out to describe adolescence? Impulsive. Moody. Unpredictable. Irresponsible, right? So like not thinking ahead to the long term. So impulsive, reactive, emotional. Guess what? They're fairness fanatics. Doesn't that perfectly describe Sharice and many other teenagers that we know? They are sensation seekers, risk takers, and peer influence is not a myth, right? It is children do what their friends do or what they think their friends are doing, right? Or sometimes what they think their friends want them to do, right? So this is what adolescence looks like. They care more about the immediate outcomes. They don't think ahead to the long-term consequences. So ultimately, they just don't make good decisions in the moment. And here's what's really important about this conversation about race and adolescence and the criminalization of children is that the research shows that adolescence looks like adolescence all over the world, not just in the United States, but children of all races and all classes and all ethnicities and all geographic spaces engage in those of adolescence that we just shared together as a group. There's no Black adolescence, no white adolescence, no Latinx adolescence, no Asian adolescence. Adolescence is just adolescence as a collection of developmental features. Yet we see time and time again that African American children and Latinx children, depending on what regions of the country, are I'm going to say radically disproportionately, overrepresented in the juvenile and criminal legal system, right? And we should note that actually youth crime, notwithstanding how the media wants to portray it in this moment, that youth crime has actually gone down significantly over the last 40 years. But as youth crime goes down, the disparities are getting wider and wider. So it's really critical. And so what we see is that even when we as adults, we as a society get annoyed at the key features of adolescence, right? The impulsivity of adolescence, for the most part, we still treat most teenagers with tolerance, grace, compassion, forgiveness, redirection. We're not trying to shame them, put them under a jail. But when it comes to African American children, you will see a radically different response. Black children are criminalized for virtually every aspect of what it means to be a teenager. So I often ask a group like this, what did you care most about when you were kids? Invariably, the kinds of answers, except for the nerds in the room. I had one talk where somebody was like, oh, I cared about my studies. Okay, first of all, not the answer I was expecting, but usually the answer that I get is the clothes they wear, the music that they listen to, the friends they get to sit with in the cafeteria, the way they style their hair, testing boundaries, seeing what risks they could take, experimenting with drugs, sex, alcohol, things that we don't want, our kids. But guess what? All of us did them and we came out just fine. And in fact, the research on adolescence shows that children who test boundaries in those ways are actually become the leaders, right? They step out and they're courageous and they do great things. But for African American children, I could pull the thread on any one of those things, right? So think about music, for example. Heavy metal, country, pop music, rock music, all has the same misogynistic themes, glorification of sex, drugs, and alcohol. All of those themes are evident virtually without consequence. We begin to talk about hip hop music, rap music, and literally the children who listen to them in the park are treated as if they are the most dangerous children alive, right? There have been empirical studies on that comparison between the themes in music. Another example is think about clothing, for example, right? Think about the tie-dye t-shirts and the bell-bottom pants that were common in the hippie era, also associated with what? Hallucinogens and weed. We never outlawed a tie-dye t-shirt. Think about the all-black attire, straight black hair that was associated with the goth era, associated with what? Mass shootings. Of course, we never outlawed all-black attire. And then finally, think about the self-proclaimed fashion statement of some white supremacist youth groups, which are the steel-toed Doc Martens with red shoelaces, right? We have never outlawed that, even though that has been associated at times with violence, right? So think about what with African American children has been demonized in terms of clothes, right? So I'm thinking here about the sagging pants. No, I don't want to see anybody in sagging pants, but there are laws on the books, right, that literally make it a crime, that create a legal justification for a police officer to stop a child when they have sagging pants, right? I don't want to see it, but should it be a basis for police-youth encounter, particularly given what we know about adolescence and about bias and how quickly those incidents from 0 to 100 in an instant? Right? And think about the black hoodie or the hoodie, period, right? That's not on the books, but the black hoodie or the hoodie has become an iconic symbol of some sort of black threat. All right. And then even Black children do engage in serious offenses, right? We treat them as if they are beyond redemption, meaning we're more likely to prosecute them as adults, more likely to find them guilty, more likely to impose severe sentences like life without the possibility of parole, and more likely to send them to solitary confinement. And just a note that so much of this criminalization occurs in schools. And Professor Grant and I may, flesh this out and talk about this more. But I wanted to ask the question, right? Why is it that the school resource officer responded to Sharice the way that he did? And there are multiple layers to that answer, but one of the most significant pieces is the ways in which Black children are perceived through a racially biased lens, the ways in which Black children are adultified. What do I mean by that? Start with young African-American boys. The research, empirical research done by Dr. Philip Atiba Goff has found that people, civilians and police officers, are likely to perceive Black boys as significantly older than they actually are. In fact, more than 4.5 years older than they actually are. Has an extraordinary impact on how we perceive and engage with young people. And then girls, like Sharice, the research is similar, showing that adults are more likely to perceive Black girls as older, more mature, more knowledgeable about adult-like topics, less innocent, like in the child welfare system, or and less in need of protection. Okay, really important in how we choose to respond to a child like Sharice. And then there's more general research covering the ways in which ambiguous facial expressions, innocuous behaviors are perceived by perceived on Black faces, right, to be threatening, more aggressive, and more consistent with violent intentions, while those same ambiguous facial expressions and innocuous behaviors are perceived and interpreted as harmless when associated with a white face. So just to give you a quick example, even children this young, right, is this child sad or angry? Is this child sad or angry? Well, here's the reality in empirical studies, notwithstanding how we react now in a moment like this where we're talking about how bias operates, the research shows that adults are more likely to inaccurately perceive anger on a Black child's face, right, than on a white face. And that misperceiving anger helps explain why so many children are disproportionately disciplined in their school, arrested in their schools. A lot of data on the disproportionate arrest in schools. Oops. Fix that real quick. Okay. And so let me just say, that's just in the school context, that example. But I really want you to understand that the spillover is real and into very much the ways in which this disproportionate policing, criminalization occurs, spills over into the street and into the community. There are now generations of Black and Latinx youth who live under what they describe as the constant surveillance of police. I can tell you in my caseload in the District of Columbia, we have children who talk about being stopped multiple times a day, right? Stopped on their way into a convenience store, stopped on the way out of a convenience store. Police officers parked in their local parks and their local recreation centers. Police officers obviously at the front door of the school. And so they describe the experience as just pervasive surveillance. And the impact is traumatic. And that's where I want to take us next, which is that the research shows that young people, Black and Latinx youth who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods, attend heavily surveilled schools, and who have been the target of significant stops and frisks report high rates of fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness. They become hypervigilant, they're always on guard, right? Not trusting police officers. And that distrust of police officers carries over to other adult authority figures who might be allies for them, teachers, counselors, mentors, right? Has a really powerful effect. The research also shows that the trauma that I'm describing here, right? The psychological trauma that I'm describing occurs not only from being the target of, or the direct target of police conduct, but also from hearing, right? So, observing it and witnessing it among other folks, right? So just having to get up in the morning and worry about coming into contact with police becomes a source of stress and anxiety for young people. Even watching the television or the internet involving high-profile incidences of police brutality, even if those are isolated incidents, is in and of itself enough to create what the researchers call, sufficient enough to create post-traumatic stress disorder and other types of depressive symptoms, right? And they call these traumatic events online. So the killing of George Floyd becomes a traumatic event online that then has all of these consequences as if you were the person who had been stopped yourself. All right. And then the final piece of trauma study that I just want to share here is that the research shows that young people who, or that police contact has a significant impact on identity development. In other words, young people who have frequent contact with the police begin to question who they are, who they can become, and how they fit in with mainstream society. Adolescence is the time in our lives when our views about law and law enforcement become fixed in our brains. So those early negative encounters with the police have a long-term impact on how we engage with, interpret, fear police officers, and how we engage with and appreciate the law. It also causes young people to question the legitimacy of law enforcement as an institution. And what the research shows, this combination of stress and this combination of questioning, right, the legitimacy of law and law enforcement actually increases crime instead of reducing crime, right? So we're actually doing ourselves a disservice, right? We reduce public safety by over-policing. So it's really critical that we get it right. All right, so then what do we do with all of this, right? How do we use this information to drive change? And so I would just say 4 themes that we can flesh out in conversation, really 4 themes. We have to radically reduce the footprint of police officers in the lives of all children, right? But especially Black and brown children who've been so disproportionately overrepresented. We need to invest in alternatives to traditional law enforcement strategies for public safety. I'll say one more word about that. And we need to insist upon developmentally appropriate policing, right? So when we do, in those rare circumstances where we do need police youth contact, it needs to be developmentally appropriate. And then finally, when kids do enter court, they get caught up in the legal system, we need to make sure that all of the decision makers are making decisions that account for race, adolescence, and trauma. So what do I mean by an alternative traditional law enforcement strategies? I just mean we need to adopt a public health strategy for safety, school safety and public safety. That is a strategy that is relational. What do I mean by that? I mean that is attentive to meaningful relationships between adults and children, right? It goes a long way, particularly in the school context. It needs to be racially just. How many of you think that my client, Sharice, and all the other clients, African-American and Latinx clients that I represent, are aware that they're being treated differently? Yes, racially just is huge, has a significant psychological impact on procedural justice and a willingness to obey the law. Restorative, we need to bridge, we need to restore, we need to rebuild those relationships that have been broken. We think about now the tension between police officers and African-American community members, right? Even when the police officers mean well. I do a lot of trainings for police officers and I say to them, right, it's the blue uniform that carries with it this legacy, right? So even when you mean well, you've got to meet the child where they are. Really important. And then it's got to be trauma responsive. We know how much children today, particularly in this post-pandemic world, this world of racial and political unrest, how traumatic it is for young people. And now we're adding that layer of the traumatic effects of policing. So what does it look like in real time? It means counselors, social workers, mental health professionals, peer intervention. It means social emotional learning in the classroom. It means positive youth interventions, restorative justice programs. And guess what? In those schools where there is real, not fake, real evidence of violence in the school system, we need violence interrupters and credible messengers who can go in and breach and go in and restore, I should say, repair the breach in that community. All right. The bottom line is really we need to invest in children, families, and communities, and not in surveillance equipment and in police officers. We need to train our police officers around adolescent development, de-escalation, racial bias. We need some basic regulatory limits on use of force. And then for all of the folks sitting here in the law school classroom, understanding that as lawyers, we have got to litigate, we have to ensure that every single child that comes before the court, that number should be very small, but every child who comes before the court has every single protection that the Constitution guarantees, right? That's the Fifth Amendment, that's the Fourth Amendment. And so we at Georgetown, at the law school, have been doing an inordinate amount of work to develop what we call our Racial Justice Toolkit, our Ambassadors for Racial Justice program. It's a fellowship program, a number of strategies to get folks thinking about how to address these critical legal questions from a racially appropriate lens. And then finally, we need to treat children like children, period, hands down. And so that means not transferring children to adult court at all. And we could talk about that. I think that's not as radical as it sounds. So we can talk about, there's evidence-based strategies for, to make sure that happens. So let's chat.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you all for coming, and happy Black History Month.
Yes.
Right? Perfect timing for this talk. I'm going to jump into the book, but before I do, we have students in the room who do have their first job lined up, some still interviewing, and some who have promised to pivot at some point in the future. So if you could talk about how you got into this work, like what drew you to be a criminal defense attorney representing children.
So I will say that I actually, I grew up in a family of teachers and preachers. And every body in my family has been committed to adolescence and to working with young people who were, I hate the word disadvantaged, but at risk and didn't have all the same opportunities. So that was number one as a foundation, subconsciously. But my aha moment actually came at Duke University. It's the first time I'm getting to say this. I was at Duke as a freshman. We had an apprenticeship program in my freshman year, first semester, over at the local courthouse. And I was assigned to juvenile court. And I will never forget the day I walked into that courthouse. I was given instructions on how to find the prosecutor. So I actually wasn't defense side. I got an apprenticeship to work with the local prosecutor in local juvenile court. Walked into the courthouse, was making my way to the juvenile courtroom. I look up and I see a line of children literally shackled by their arms and their legs being escorted down the hallway. And I stopped dead in my tracks and I just stared. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, as if, we were still in an era of slavery. I just didn't know that people were still shackling kids and escorting them around. I walked into the courtroom, sat down next to the prosecutor, and I was young and bold. And I looked at her and I said, you know what? I'd really like to be over there. And I pointed across the table to the defense table. And I said, I want to be, representing the kids. And she was very gracious about it and was like, I need to just introduce you to the prosecutor. That was my aha moment. That was absolutely at freshman year undergrad at Duke.
Okay, thank you. And court watching is something that you all can do while you're in law school. And if you have questions about how to make that happen, come to the Children's Law Clinic or our criminal defense attorneys. They can tell you how to make that happen. So thank you for sharing. Getting into the book, so this is not another academic text, it's not a case book, right? Can you talk about your process, how you selected the stories that are in the book, and a little bit about the cover? Like, as a parent of a little black boy, this evokes a little something in me. So if you could talk about how you selected the stories after all these years of representing so many clients.
Yes, so I will say this. Okay, for all the law professors in the room, just close your ears, right? So I love being a law professor, but I don't love writing like a law professor, right? So you have to publish your papers. I hope many of you in this room become law professors. I really do love my job. But so I write, my standard law review articles and, try to make a difference in litigating race in Fourth Amendment analysis, et cetera. But I am very, very clear. If I want to make a difference in the world, I need to change hearts and minds. And the way to change hearts and minds is through telling stories, real stories about real people. And so what this book is in many ways, a compilation of many of the clients, the shock and awe stories that I have been involved in my 26 years as a youth defense attorney. And I should say I started as an adult defense, juvenile, then adult, and then back to juvenile defense attorney. And so these are the shock and awe stories. Plus, woven in are many of the high profile stories. You cannot write this book and not talk about Tamir Rice, right? And Jeremiah Harvey, names that I urge you all to read. And so you ask, so the number one reason for not writing an academic text is I wanted it to be read. I wanted it to be read far and wide by sorry. That's the part where the law profession should close their mouth. But be read by teachers and nurses and lawmakers and folks. And so that's what this has done. And even by teenagers. I actually honestly, I knew I was writing this to make a difference, but somehow young people have gotten a hold of it and they've read about it and done various things with it. So that's what we want. How do you pick the story? With shock and awe. And I will say to particularly every student in the room who's going into law, that I urge you to keep a catalog of shock and awe stories. The things that you encounter in your gut is not sitting right, that make you angry, that make you outraged, and save them. And so when I was at the DC Public Defender Service, quite some time ago, we were still on hard copies of everything. So I had literally a file cabinet, and I had a folder of those cases over the years that really bothered me, right? Never in a million years did I think I was going to write a book. I just, for something in me, said, put them in this folder, and I kept them. Then, as you know, we became electronic. I started having electronic files. I literally have a file, DC cases that drive me crazy, something like that. They're just the police reports. And so sure enough, when I got an opportunity to, honestly, what happened was I got an opportunity to write a chapter of a book, in a book called Policing the Black Man. And they did not have a chapter on children. And I was like, you cannot have a you cannot have a book about policing black men without talking about policing black boys. And so actually the publishing company stopped, held up the press to give me an opportunity to put a chapter in. And I realized in writing that chapter, we needed a whole book. And there are so many more stories that I was pulling from my shock and awe folder. So that's what this is. It's a collection of shock and awe. But I also recognize that you cannot just tell stories, right? Some lawmakers aren't going to believe it. They're going to say what you're doing is anecdotal, right? These are the one-offs. These are the rogue police officers. No. So I weave into the stories data. Right? Data demonstrating how pervasive every racial disparity is in every aspect of the juvenile and criminal legal system. And I weave in the empirical research on adolescent development, on the traumatic effects of policing, on cognitive bias, on stereotype threat. So it is meant to be for those folks who need the science, you got that. For those folks who need the data, you got that. And for those folks who are moved and compelled by stories, you have that. So I hope that's it. And then, you wanted to know about the... So this is powerful, is it not? So this was insane. There's a much longer story. I won't tell the whole story, other than to say that. So Oliver Monday is a graphic artist who specializes in pieces on social justice. Every artistic thing that he does book covers, he does magazine covers, he does murals, whatever he's doing, it's social justice. And I've loved his work. Somebody gave me as a gift a book of Oliver Monday artwork, just as a gift. And I was flipping through and I said to my publisher, I really want something by Oliver Monday. Lo and behold, the man worked. He had a contract with Penguin Random House. The craziest story ever. And I picked out 5 images from his book. And I said, can you all commission him to do a cover that reflects my book, on social justice? This one was already in his book, was one of 3 unattached images that belonged to him. In other words, every other image in the book was assigned to someone else, had been purchased by someone else, except for this one. And they bought it. It could not been more perfect. It's obviously a bullseye in the kids' backpack, and the ways in which Black kids are constantly targeted and bullied. So it is painful. They had arguments. They had full meetings in Penguin Random House whether this was too much or not too much. It was a huge debate about whether they were going to do it or not do it. But.
And the title, Rage of Innocence.
Oh, the title. So the Rage of Innocence is truly, it has multiple meanings, but the overarching concept is it is the rage that every single one of us should have when any one child is deprived of an opportunity to be children. That's the rage we should have. But of course, it has multiple layers of meaning. It is also the rage that African American, that Black children have when they are told over and over and over again that they are to be feared, that they are dangerous, that they are to be isolated, that they are less than. And this is so important. Every human being, right, who has an ounce of dignity and self-worth should stand up for themselves and push back. When you're a teenager, when you're an adolescent, you don't have the words or the emotional wherewithal to give a dissertation, right, on why, you should not be treating me this way. So I like to say to people, we cannot expect a teenager to say, Mr. Officer, I don't like the way you're treating me today. Instead, what do? They curse. They yell, they scream. Sometimes, it's fight, fright, or flees. They fight back, right? But they're fighting back about that label. So it's the rage of innocence. It's that rage that happens when we deprive human beings with dignity and self-worth of an opportunity to push back.
Thank you. Thank you for setting that up. So let's get into it.
Yeah.
There is another story in the introduction of the book, right? Yeah. And when we talk about data, I think it so perfectly illustrates what we're seeing on a day-to-day basis. Yes. The story of Eric.
Yes.
So if you could share a little bit about Eric's story and like how that puts everything into the context.
Yeah. So again, every single story in this book is real. This is another one of my massive aha moments as a defense attorney. But again, myself and one of my students, we represented a client in DC. This kid was, I think he's 14 years old, 13-year-old African-American boy who on a Saturday night was watching television. He sees somebody with a Molotov cocktail in a movie. This is a child doing what kids do. He doesn't research it, doesn't look it up, doesn't ask anybody what a Molotov cocktail is or how to make it. He just decides he wants to make something that looks like this. He goes into his kitchen, he grabs a glass bottle from under the sink. He then begins to pour in whatever liquid, saying you all, Pine Sol, bleach, water. These are water soluble. It is not blowing anything up. My favorite part of the story is he grabs a piece of toilet paper. He runs the toilet paper from the inside of the bottle to the outside of the bottle and closes the cap, right? Kids, it's what kids do. He literally, I've been to the house. His mother's carpet is white. And so after he plays with it for a little while, he puts the bottle in his book bag so that it doesn't spill out on his mother's white carpet. Monday morning comes, he gets up, he goes to school. What do kids do? He grabs his book bag, doesn't look in it, forgets it's in there. He goes in through the metal detector, puts the bag through the metal detector. School resource officer says, "Hey, what is this?" He's like, "Huh? Oh, that's nothing. You can throw it away." He then goes on to class. Little does he know that is the beginning of a 9-month ordeal in juvenile court. Those folks they called the police, they called the fire department, they went to his class, they escorted him out of class, and then ultimately between classes, he gets escorted down the hallway and arrested. All right, for what? Attempted arson and possession of a Molotov cocktail. You guys, this case goes on, gets the same thing, held in detention overnight, executed formally the next day, and is in court for 9 months because we absolutely refused to plead guilty. It was just, it was just nonsense. So we, litigated all kinds of pretrial issues. We hired an expert to show, this is ridiculous amount of money on this friggin' ridiculous case. Hired an expert witness to show that it was, not flammable. We set our day the morning of trial, and the government came in and said, "Look, we'll dismiss. We will, if you plead guilty to a regulatory offense, which was the possession, that came up with something. They literally made something up so that we could do a plea to a regulatory offense. And they gave us permission, like they have to give us permission, gave us permission to argue for a dismissal. We can get a dismissal after adjudication. And we immediately argued for dismissal, and the judge dismissed the case. 9 months. This kid got expelled from school, you all. He was a special education student. I mean, just the list goes on of the consequences. Now, here's the kicker, and this is why I'm sure Professor Grant wants me to tell the story. Some months later, I am giving a lecture in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm not even giving a lecture, I'm on a panel, and I share this story of Eric in the middle of the room. Do you know that a woman came up to me after my comments on the panel, and she said, "My son did the same thing." You all, this was a white woman. She said her son in Connecticut had done the exact same thing, make a Molotov cocktail, and took it to school on purpose. I said, "What happened to him?" You know what they did to him? They put him in advanced, accelerated science classes. That was my aha moment. I literally almost lost my mind. And that was it. That was it. Living in the District of Columbia, and I told you, having so many African-American clients, you forget sometimes that there's still racial disparity. You get caught up doing your job, and you don't realize that white kids in upper Northwest, in our city are doing the same things. It was that moment. It all came flooding back. And it changed the way I practice law. It literally changed everything about what I do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It should shock us, and if it's not shocking us, there's a problem, right?
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So we were talking about the fact that in Durham, we have a progressive prosecutor.
Yes.
So what that looks like is we're not seeing the high volume of children being prosecuted in criminal court, but not the same volume as we are seeing in the rest of the state and the country, right? But one of the things that we are seeing here, as with everywhere else, is the reliance on school resource officers.
Yes.
And you mentioned it earlier, SROs.
Yeah.
Can you tell us your thoughts on how schools are relying on SRLs and how that impacts what we're seeing in the data? Yeah.
It's huge, and part of what's happening is I want to call it, okay, this is a very benign answer. It's a lack of imagination about what the alternatives to public safety are. All right, that's the benign answer. The other answer, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, which is to target and disproportionately arrest Black and brown children. And I think there is historical justification for that, because I will tell you that for the longest time, I've been doing this work for 26 years, you all, for the longest time, I accepted the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools today because teachers and parents were afraid to send their children back to school after Columbine. Right, the mass shooting in Colorado in 1998. That's what I thought. Everybody tells you that. When you go back for this book, I went back and did some of the research. What you learn is the actual first police officer to appear in school appeared in 1939 in Indianapolis, in response to the earliest even inkling of a conversation about integrating schools. All right. Fast forward to the civil rights era, the 50s and the 60s, schools increased exponentially. I mean, literally exploded. All right. In response to what? An effort to under the guise of creating a safe passage for Black and brown students to integrate schools. We know from the historical record and from the iconic photographs that, in fact, police in schools became an impediment integration. Now, fast forward to the 1990s, right? In the heart of the 1990s, we have the federal government funneling in dollars into local school systems that would agree to have police in schools. What's going on in the mid-1990s? 1990s is the super predator era, when the proclaimed super predator era, when Princeton professor John DiIulio called the super predators and predicted that in writing, that Black children, African-American children, would basically run amok and rape, maim, and kill all of America by the year 2000. Within a year, crime had already begun to plummet again, right? And his theory was disproved within a year, and he had to recant. The damage was already done. Right? So all that money for police in schools starts really ramping up around then. And we have repeatedly, in every administration, Democratic or Republican, have increased dollars for police in schools after major school shootings. Notwithstanding all of the empirical research that demonstrates time and time again that police in schools don't prevent school shootings and, in fact, do worse. Right? They actually increase the trauma that we've been talking about, right? And that police in schools means more arrest in schools, means more arrest of Black and brown children. And there's data showing that Black boys are 2.4 times more likely to be arrested in school than a white boy, and Black girls 3.6 times more likely to be arrested at their school than a white girl. I mean, the data is huge that it's not working. And that we know what works, you all. We know what works, but we don't do it.
Yeah. So what you're doing in the book is you're telling the individual stories, but you're also telling the story of America.
That's right.
And if you do systemic work, you have to go back and not just accept the narrative that you're given, but go back and see where the story truly starts. So I'm going to have one more question before I open it up, because I want to make sure that people in the audience have a lot of time for questions. So in the Children's Law Clinic, we are seeing a lot of children with disabilities. That's
Yes.
kind of the bread and butter of what we do, the special education cases. And so we know that students with disabilities are disproportionately disciplined and removed from school.
That's right.
So what are your observations on race and disability?
Yes, yes. And so absolutely, just to underscore your first point, which is that youth with disabilities are far more likely to end up arrested. And we see that, I can tell you anecdotally, my caseload is that, and then we can see it compounded by race, right? And so what we are seeing, for example, just to really give it context, especially children with emotional challenges, emotional limitations, children with speech and language impediments, really, really struggle. Children, when I think about speech and language impediments, I'm thinking about children who really have a hard time processing who, what, where, when, why. Well, what do school resource officers do? They race up on you. What are you doing? Why are you out of place? Where and children absolutely cannot process it. Many children feel out of control. And so what do when you feel out of control? You melt down. You have these emotional outbursts. So you combine adolescent impulsivity, right, with the learning and emotional and cognitive and speech and language disabilities. And so it's just absolutely, profound. Also, what we're seeing is that school resource officers are not trained. Not only there's some data that was put out demonstrating that police officers aren't trained on adolescence in general and adolescent de-escalation, adolescent brain, the psychosocial features of adolescence. Very, few get adequate training on that, if at all, and then even less get training on, kids with special education needs, things of that nature. And so instead of using police officers, we need behavioral intervention specialists with trained expertise in various learning disabilities to engage with young people. So that's one thing. So then compounding all of that with race. So what did we talk about? Those slides where I talk about how, and there's so many more studies, talking about how we observe and engage with Black and brown youth through that racially biased lens, right? So those ambiguous facial expressions, those innocuous behaviors, the outbursts, the profanity, all of that come from these, limitations on one's ability to communicate, all of that is being viewed from a racially biased lens, right? And so they are perceived to be more aggressive, more violent, a threat to the school. We are much quicker to isolate them, either within the school, in special classes, or to expel them entirely, or to arrest them at schools. And so what we see that Black youth I can't even remember what the data point is, like 3 times, I'm pretty sure I have it on a slide for another training that I've done, something like 3 times more likely than a white child with disability to end up getting arrested and referred to the court system. So the disparity is really, really, really profound. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna take some questions from the audience. I could keep going, but I want to give you guys a chance to ask your questions, so.
So much.
Yeah.
This was, as I expected, extremely powerful, and you talked really beautifully about sort of systemic responses to some of what you identified. And I know you also do lots of trainings on this, but I wondered if you could speak specifically to those of us who are in practice or aspiring to be in practice, like on an individual case basis, how you incorporate some of the
Absolutely.
data, sort of systemic things that you're seeing, and how judges or other decision makers respond.
Are responding. So this is a beautiful question for anybody who's like in the criminal clinic, thinks you want to be adult criminal defense attorney or youth defense attorney. We really have done a series of modules, training modules that we are trying to get out across the country on race and the Fourth Amendment. Race and interrogation, race and disposition, like race, you name it, like all of these issues. So I can take the Fourth Amendment, for example. Here's a traditional law review article. I rarely, sort of sell you on a law review article, but there's an article called The Reasonable Black Child, Race, Adolescence, and the Fourth Amendment. And it literally it was the foundation for the training that we now do all across the country. And so what is that about? It is a recognition as an outset that the criminal, the legal standard in criminal law is based on a reasonable person. What would a reasonable police officer think in a given situation? What would a reasonable, I'm going to say man because that's the way it's been dictated, right? What would a reasonable man as a suspect, be perceiving? And the argument is that you have to look at that. You can no longer operate the Fourth Amendment, interpret and apply the Fourth Amendment on a reasonable man standard. It has got to take into account adolescence, and it's got to take into account race, even if it's an adult. And so every single critical question in the Fourth Amendment analytical framework is impacted by adolescence and by race. So let me just do race, right? So think about the question of whether or not a person has been seized for purposes of the Fourth Amendment analysis. The standard is what? I would, if we had more time, ask you all, but I will not do Socratic method, right? But, the Fourth Amendment seizure, whether or not a person is free to leave. How many of you think race is relevant to free to leave? Of course, right? So you ask the question, I can just say that. Of course, we all know this, that a black person is less likely to feel free to leave. Judges, if you want them to buy it, they need the science, right? That's where we bring in that research, the traumatic effects, the empirical studies on the traumatic effects of policing. We bring that in. We bring in the sociological research on the talk. Everybody know what the talk is? Where black parents are forced to tell their children, keep your hands up. We bring all of that in and put it in a pleading. Okay. We also bring in data about how black children know that black kids are disproportionately more likely to be stopped. We bring in also, even before this empirical research on trauma and policing and trauma is new. You all, this is less than 15 years old. It is really, some of it is much newer than that. Before then, I still have pleadings when we were beginning to think about it. We would attach newspaper articles to a Fourth Amendment pleading showing Freddie Gray in Baltimore, okay? Right next to my jurisdiction, right? How he was, killed on a rough ride by the police. These are examples to show and you find local examples, right? The kids who've been killed by police in DC to show the judges that there's no child living in the District of Columbia who would not know this story. This is why they're afraid. So that helps me in my seizure argument. All of that goes in the pleading. Think about another question in the Fourth Amendment framework, consent to search. How many children, and I tell stories in the book about kids who, a police officer walks up to you and says, hey, can I see your waistband? What is the police officer asking? He's asking the kids to lift up their shirts so that they can see that the kids have no guns, right? My kid says, no, my kid says, sure, lift up my shirt. You see nothing. He puts his shirt back down and keeps on walking. Officer's not satisfied. What do they do next? The officers say, well, can I search you? What do these 15-year-old black boys do? They say yes. And then what do the police? We found a gun on him because he consented to the search. Under what theory is that a valid consent? And so again, we make all of our arguments that no black child in the District of Columbia or anywhere in the United States of America would have ever thought that they were able to decline consent to that search, right? We use we start with the Supreme Court case. Bustamante says that, consent to search must be free of coercion and duress. And we argue that it's inherent. Any police youth contact with the African-American youth is inherently coercive and full of duress, all right? So these are just two examples. The list goes on. Reasonable articulable suspicion, right? So they say that a kid who runs from the police is evidence of consciousness of guilt. Is that consciousness of guilt, you all, to run from the police? Actually, for most people, it's not. Okay? But for a black child, why does a black child run from the police? They run from the police because they're afraid. They use nervousness as evidence of reasonable articulable suspicion. Why is a black child shaking like a leaf? The number of cases where our police officers come and testify in court, I knew he had a gun because he was shaking like a leaf. I'm sorry, you knew he was terrified of you because he was shaking like a leaf. So that's what we're doing. We are literally remapping every legal question, criminal legal question we can through a race lens, a psychological trauma lens, sociological lens, data lens.
So I guess generally, are there any studies about how parenting kind of plays into this? Because obviously you want to raise kids who can advocate for themselves and have high self-esteem, but it's not always safe to do so in these situations. So I guess, is there like any study on this, on like what works?
Yeah, so it's so funny. Professor Grant and I were talking about this before coming in. We think it's just such a critical issue. It's so important. I actually have a whole chapter called mass incarceration, or the Black family in the era of mass incarceration. And I think that's it. No, I'm sorry. It's in chapter 5 on identity development. The reason why I highlight it for you is because I have a whole section on Black parents and what it means and how Black parents have to walk this very, very delicate tightrope. On the one hand, you have no choice but to prepare your children to do whatever they have to do to get home safe, right? On the other hand, you don't want to over-prepare them so that they are terrified to live in society, right? So that they can never see police officer as a potential ally, so that they can never see a white person as a potential ally. We are setting our children up for fail if we overcompensate. So it's a very delicate balance. And so I haven't found a ton of research on it, but what we have, found is that that what is helpful, and this is what, part of what is helpful is you tell the child the truth, that you will encounter these inevitable moments of discrimination in your life, whether they're with police or whether they're with school, whether they're in healthcare, whether they're in recreation, you're going to have these moments. But what I need you to do, son, daughter, non-binary child, I need you to recognize that no matter what, you are still strong, you are still beautiful. So it's the offsetting with Black pride, right? So that whole historical evidence of, and it's not tried at all, the psychological importance of showing children that discrimination has existed before you and that Black people as a community have overcome it, right? Like that Rosa Parks, survived and made real change because she sat still, and Claudette Colvin before her. Do you see what I'm saying? So it's about and so this whole challenge and attack on, theory in elementary school, because it's not. It doesn't exist. But the teaching of Black pride, right, in schools is so damaging because it hurts. This is exactly the tool that we need to use to help Black kids, right, to overcome and to navigate these balances. And the third and final thing I'll say about it is not only do we have no choice but to tell them, but then we also have to create for them space to push back safely. Right? And so it is really hard because you can tell your child, don't curse at the police as many times as you want. And then when they are in that impulsive fairness fanatic mode, it's hard. That's right. It is so hard to get them to calm down. And you can relate. You can understand it. You can't even right in the moment. I don't know if I could stay sane and quiet in a bad day, but promising them, if you stay safe, if you get home, we can do something together. We can, go to the local school and, and lodge a complaint. We can do a protest together. We can write an op-ed. I will be there with you if you just get home safe, right? You got to let them know we'll work it out when you get back. So that's what.
My question is about individual cases similarly to Professor Fine's, but when you're working with the children that are facing these problems head on, as a practitioner, how do you respond to that trauma in a developmentally appropriate way?
That's a great question. And I'm going to tell you, just being brutally honest, as a practitioner, it's very hard. I love the training work because it allows me to separate and do this work, right? It is hard in the moment. Our children are in crisis on so many levels. There is, in the District of Columbia, and I know it's different in every city, there is a true hatred of police officers in our city. So helping them sort of, get them to talk to us about that trauma in a way that's not triggering and re-traumatizing, right? But that is useful to get the information that we need to litigate, right? This helps and improves and enhances the litigation. I recognize that. But it's hard to do that. And then also trying to get them therapy and counseling. But I got to tell you all, this policing as trauma is on top of, right? It's cumulative with all the other trauma that they're experiencing in their lives. So it is so core, it's so hard to get them to nail down on that. When I've got a kid whose mom's got cancer and who lost 3 people in the pandemic, whose father got shot, whose sibling got shot, the whole 9, right? And so it's a piece of a much bigger puzzle. And so we do the best that we can. asking the questions when we can. And sometimes we just make the arguments on the litigation front, as best we can, knowing what we know from research and data, and then focus the child on the other traumas because we recognize that that's just more important, honestly. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here. But my question focuses, we talked a lot about like the over-policing of predominantly Black spaces.
Yeah.
I'm curious about in spaces that are predominantly white.
Yes.
With like few Black people, the weaponization of the police.
Yes.
Towards those individuals.
Yes.
Is that something that we should be addressing more on the police side and how they handle those situations, or with individuals and their inherent biases?
So excellent question. So one of the things that I usually like to say on one of my slides is that when I use the word policing, I'm not just talking about police in the blue uniform, but I'm talking about all of us in society who over police by calling 911, weaponizing, the 911 call or the calling of the SRO. And so I think it's got to be a both and. Really has to be a both and. I think teachers, and we were just talking about this, teachers, school nurses, school resource officers, counselors, behavior intervention specialists, all have to be trained. And I hate the word trained, but it's just that we've got to be educated and aware of our own biases. And I do a series of workshops called See Something, Say Something that are concrete, actionable. How do you interrupt bias when you see it? Right? So it can't just be we talk about it. I don't need another class, another law review, another, explanation of what implicit racial bias is. I need somebody to tell me how to interrupt it. And so that's a part of what we're doing. And I think everybody in every space should do that. So the question about the hyper-policing of Black youth in white spaces absolutely happens. I am not great on that, the data points, but there is data points on that. How, Black kids in schools that are predominantly white feel. It's a psychological feel, it's an actual feel, even if you have only here's another way to know, like in somewhere like Maine, or like somewhere where there's a very low population of African Americans, how is it possible that they still are extraordinarily disproportionately overrepresented in school discipline, school-based arrest, and the criminal legal system? It's absurd, right? So it just shows you how powerful the effect is. And it's even more powerful in states where, in locations that are predominantly white and have very small percentages of African Americans. The fear is a national fear. It's a social, so it's not isolated to Black spaces. So it's a great question. Love for you to do some additional research on, Black folks in white spaces. It's difficult, but you also have to create spaces, affinity groups, conversations, healing circles for people of color in those populations, right, where they feel isolated and alone. I think that's true in a place, honestly, like a Duke, and I went to a school. Where was I? Oh my God. It was a college, a small college. And I swear, you guys, this entire college, there might have been, in all the grades, it was an undergrad, 10 Black kids. And they were like sobbing by the time I got through with my lecture. I had no idea what I was walking into, right? But it's a really powerful and painful space to be when you're really, really in small numbers and you feel isolated and targeted and criminalized. So it's a great question.
Unfortunately, we are at our time. Where did the hour go? There's so much more work to be done, so I feel we're going to have to have you back. So thank you so much for joining me.
Here. And sign up.
Yes.
Jennifer Melton is doing